The air in the gilded chime hummed with a quiet, expensive kind of sound. It wasn't noise, really. It was the clink of sterling silver against fine porcelain, the low murmur of conversations about stocks and sailboats, and the soft sigh of someone sinking into a velvet chair. The light was warm and golden, catching the dust motes dancing above the grand piano in the corner. An elegant, silent beast of polished ebony. Through this world of soft light and quiet wealth moved Alara. Her feet, insensible black shoes, knew every inch of the patterned carpet. Her hands, quick and capable, balanced trays loaded with food that cost more than her hourly wage. She wore the uniform, a crisp white shirt, a black vest, a tight knot of hair at the back of her head like a second skin. To the people in the booths, she was part of the scenery. A polite smile bringing a plate of seared scallops. A quiet voice asking if they needed more sparkling water. But if you looked closely, and no one ever did, you might see the distance in her eyes. They were the color of a stormy sea, and they seemed focused on something far beyond the restaurant's gilded walls. They tracked her tables, refilled glasses, and nodded at requests, but behind them was a constant, quiet calculation. Rent, student loan payment number 57 of 300, the clicking meter of her life, measured in tips and tired hours. Her fingers, as she cleared a plate of crumbs with a small silver scraper, were long and slender. There was a faint, old callus on the tip of her right thumb, a relic from a different life. Sometimes, when she passed the silent piano, her gaze would linger on its closed lid for a half-second too long before she wrenched it away. In the prime corner booth, the one with the best view and the most privacy, sat a man named Alistair Finch. Everyone in the city knew his name, or at least, everyone who moved in circles where money was both a tool and a sport. He wasn't old, but he carried the undeniable weight of success. His hair was silvered at the temples. His suit was the kind that didn't have a label on the inside because it didn't need one. And his watch was simple, elegant, and could probably pay off a small mortgage. Tonight, he was celebrating. A deal had been closed, a rival company elegantly outmaneuvered. He sat with two associates, a man and a woman, their postures relaxed, their laughter a low, confident rumble. Alara had served them all evening. She knew the rhythm of a table like this, the initial scrutiny, the gradual indifference as they became engrossed in their own world. She brought their wine, a bottle so expensive the sommelier presented it with a small ceremony. She delivered their steaks, cooked precisely to their obscure specifications. She was invisible, and she preferred it that way. As she approached to clear their dessert plates empty except for smears of chocolate, and a single forgotten berry, Finch's voice rose slightly above the table's murmur. He was gesturing not with his fork, but with his whole hand. Taking in the room, this place, he said, his voice a rich baritone that demanded attention even when he wasn't trying. It has all the right pieces. The art, the china, the wine list. The acoustics in this room are actually exceptional. He tapped his fingernail against his water glass, producing a pure, ringing tone. But after 7 o'clock, it has no soul. It's a beautiful shell. His eyes, sharp and assessing, swept the room and landed, not on the art or the architecture, but on Alara. She was bent over the table, carefully picking up a dessert fork. She felt his gaze like a small spotlight and kept her eyes down, hoping it would pass. You, Finch said. Alara froze, then slowly straightened. Sir, you have the hands of a pianist, he stated, as if announcing a fact he'd just discovered. He wasn't smiling. It was an observation, cold and clinical. Elara felt a jolt, like a small electric shock up her spine. She instinctively curled her fingers slightly, hiding them against the palm of her hand. I used to play, a little, a long time ago. Used to. Finch leaned back, a slow, predatory smile spreading across his face. He was a man who enjoyed games, challenges, breaking the monotony. The deal was done. Now he needed new entertainment. His eyes flicked to the grand piano, a sleeping giant in the corner. That instrument is a crime to leave silent. Give us a tune, something to give this room the soul it's missing. A hot flush crept up Alara's neck. The other diners at nearby tables had stopped talking, listening in. She became acutely aware of her apron, a little stained from the dinner rush. Oh, no, sir, I couldn't. I'm working, and I'm really just. I'll make it worth your while. Finch interrupted, his tone leaving no room for argument. He reached into his breast pocket, pulled out a sleek money clip, and peeled off a single, crisp $100 bill. He placed it on the tablecloth, smoothing it flat with his fingertips. The green looked garish against the white linen. The room seemed to hold its breath. Alara's manager, a nervous man named Paul who appeared near the kitchen door, gave her a wide-eyed, desperate look. The message was clear, he's a VIP. Do what he asks. Don't make a scene, Alara's heart hammered against her ribs. $100 was more than she'd make in tips on a slow Tuesday. It was a tank of gas. It was groceries. It was a direct debit to Sally Mae that wouldn't bounce. But the price felt enormous. The piano in the corner wasn't just an instrument. It was a doorway. And behind that door was a room full of old ghosts and a failure so sharp it still took her breath away. She looked from the money to Finch's expectant face, to the silent, watching room. The air was thick with anticipation, a mix of curiosity and mild cruelty. They wanted to see the waitress perform. They wanted a story to tell at their next party. You should have seen it. This waitress Finch ordered to play. Her mouth was dry. For a second, she considered walking away, handing in her apron, and never looking back. But the weight of her reality, the bills on her kitchen table, the relentless calendar of payments was heavier than her fear. Without a word, her face pale but set, she untied her apron. The simple act felt monumental. She folded it neatly, walked it over to the stunned manager, and placed it in his hands. 5 minutes, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Then she turned. Every eye in the gilded chime was on her as she walked across the room. The click of her sensible shoes on the hardwood floor echoed in the quiet. She felt like she was walking the plank. The grand piano loomed larger with each step. She reached it, her hand hovering over the polished lid before she gently opened it, revealing the familiar battlefield of black and white keys. She sat on the plush stool, its height all wrong for her. She adjusted it mechanically, her movement stiff. She could feel the pressure of the stairs on her back like a physical weight. The ghosts were here now, whispering in her ear, reminding her of another room, another silent, watching crowd, and the terrible, deafening silence that had followed when her hands had frozen. She placed her fingers on the cool ivory of the keys. The first note was waiting. The whole room was waiting. And Alara, alone on the island of the piano bench, closed her eyes, trying to find a way back to a place she thought she'd left behind forever. The silence in the room was complete now. It wasn't a peaceful quiet, but a thick, heavy thing, full of held breaths and sharp curiosity. Alara's back was to all of them, a straight line in her white server's shirt against the dark, imposing shape of the piano. She was an island in a sea of velvet and polished wood, and the water around her was very still, waiting for a storm. Her fingers rested on the keys, but they felt foreign. They felt like someone else's hands. These were the hands that carried 3 plates at once, that scrubbed coffee stains from mugs, that typed out orders on a flickering screen. They weren't these delicate, trained tools from a past life. The callus on her thumb, the one from the old practice room, seemed to burn against the smooth ivory. She closed her eyes tighter, trying to block it all out. But the memories rushed in, not as pictures, but as sounds and feelings. The smell of rosin and old wood in the practice rooms at the conservatory. The precise, unforgiving tick of the metronome. The dry, tight feeling in her throat the moment before her final performance. She could hear the rustle of the program, see the blurred faces of the professors in the first row, their expressions blank, ready to judge. And then the worst sound of all, the nothing, the catastrophic, echoing silence when her mind had gone utterly blank, her hands freezing above the keys like stones. The polite, painful cough from the audience, the walk off the stage, her dream dissolving with every step. That was the ghost that lived in this piano. That was the fear that had made her pack her sheet music into a box and shove it under her bed. She had told herself it was a clean break, that she was choosing a practical life. But the truth was, she had run away. The music hadn't left her. She had left it, because it hurt too much to fail at the thing you loved most, a voice. Thin and reedy, cut through the memory. It was one of Finch's associates, a woman with a sharp laugh. "Well, we haven't got all night," a few people in the room tittered. The sound quickly swallowed by the tense atmosphere. The sound of that laugh did something to Alara. It sharpened her fear into a single, clear point. This wasn't about them. Not really. This wasn't even about the $100 on the table, though she could picture it so clearly. That green rectangle of temporary relief. This was about the ghost. She had spent years carefully walking around the empty space where her music used to be, and now this man, with his money and his boredom, had shoved her right back into the center of it. She couldn't play for them. She couldn't play for his money, or their amusement, or to be the evening's bizarre entertainment. The very idea made her feel sick. But as she sat there, The pressure building, a strange, rebellious thought surfaced. What if she played for the ghost? What if she played for the girl she used to be? The one who loved the feel of the keys before she learned to fear the audience. What if she played not to prove anything to anyone in this room, but just to speak, to say the thing she hadn't been able to say for years? Her teacher, a kind man with endless patience, had once told her, when the nerves come, forget the room, forget the people. The music isn't out there, it's in here. He had tapped his own chest. Play the feeling, not the notes. She took a deep, shaky breath that was almost a sob. She let the image of the restaurant fade, the crystal, the velvet, the watching eyes. She let go of Finch's smug expectation, of her manager's panic, of her own crushing embarrassment. In her mind, she wasn't in the gilded chime. She was in a small, sunlit room at the conservatory, late in the afternoon, playing just because it made the world make sense. Her fingers, which had been stiff and cold, began to remember. They settled into a position, not for a showy piece to impress a crowd, but for something else. Something true. She didn't start with a melody. She started with a single note. She pressed down the key for a low C-sharp deep in the bass clef. She didn't tap it. She leaned into it, letting the weight of her arm sink into the key. The sound that came out wasn't pretty. It wasn't a tinkling cocktail piano sound. It was a deep, resonant, lonely asterisk boom asterisk that vibrated up through the piano bench, through the floor, and into the very bones of the room. It was a sound of profound sadness, a door groaning open on a long-closed room. It hung in the air, thick and alive, for what felt like an age. Every last whisper in the room died. The woman who had spoken earlier froze, her wine glass halfway to her lips. The clatter from the kitchen seemed to stop. That one note had commanded a silence deeper than any that had come before. And then, Elara began to play. It was Chopin's Nocturne in C-sharp minor. It was not a happy piece. It was a conversation between sorrow and beauty, a lament that somehow also held a fragile hope. Her left hand began a steady, rocking rhythm, like a heartbeat, or like waves against a shore at night. Then her right hand entered, the melody unfolding like a story told in sighs. She wasn't thinking about the notes. She was thinking about the long bus rides to the conservatory in the rain. She was thinking about the blisters on her fingers from hours of practice. She was thinking about the first time she ever heard a piece by Chopin and felt her heart crack open with the beauty of it. She was thinking about the crushing weight of expectation and the even heavier weight of giving up. All of it poured out through her fingers. The technique was still there, buried deep in muscle memory, the precise shaping of a phrase, the delicate balance between the hands. But it was the emotion that was raw and undisguised. You could hear the loss in every lingering note. You could hear the love in every tender resolution. The music filled the opulent room, but it didn't match the decor. It transformed it. The golden light seemed to grow dimmer, sadder. The velvet drapes seemed to hold the sound close. At a table near the back, an older couple stopped eating entirely. The woman reached over and quietly placed her hand over her husband's. They didn't look at each other. They just listened, their faces soft with the memory the music had stirred. Finch, the venture capitalist, had stopped smiling. His elbows were on the table, his chin resting on his steepled fingers. His gaze was fixed on Elara's back, but he wasn't seeing a waitress anymore. He was hearing a story, a conflict, a depth of feeling that no business presentation had ever conveyed. The associate who had laughed earlier now sat perfectly still, her earlier amusement replaced by something like awe and a touch of shame. Elara played through the piece's turbulent middle section, the notes rushing like a panic, before returning to the main theme. Now even more heartbreaking because it was a return to sadness after a struggle. She wasn't performing. She was having a private conversation in a public place, and everyone in the room was holding their breath, listening in. As she approached the final, fading chords, the last of her fear fell away. There was only the music, and the release of finally letting it out. The final notes were so soft they were almost just a suggestion of sound, a whisper of goodbye. She lifted her hands, letting the last vibration fade into nothing. For a long moment, there was no sound at all, no applause, no movement. It was as if the room itself was exhaling, slowly, carefully. Then, a single, clear sound broke the silence. It wasn't clapping. It was the sound of a chair leg scraping heavily against the wooden floor. Alistair Finch was standing up. The sound of the chair scraping was loud in the perfect quiet. It was a real sound, a human sound, breaking the spell of the music. Alistair Finch stood up, but he didn't clap. He just stood there, looking at the back of the woman at the piano. His face was impossible to read. It wasn't the amused, challenging look from before. It was something more serious. Like a man who had just discovered a crack in a wall he thought was solid. Slowly, as if moving through water, he walked away from his booth. His expensive shoes made no sound on the carpet. He walked past the other tables, where people were still frozen, some with their forks held in midair. He didn't look at any of them. His whole focus was on Alara. She still had her back to the room. Her shoulders were slumped, not in defeat, but in a kind of empty exhaustion. The energy, the emotion she had poured into the piano, was gone now, leaving her feeling hollow and shaky. The ghost had been faced, the words had been spoken, and now there was nothing left but the silence and the waiting. She braced herself for what would come next. Polite, confused applause, maybe pity. Perhaps Finch would just walk back to his table, say nothing, and leave the $100 as a strange tip. He didn't do any of that. He stopped a few feet from the piano bench, close enough that she could sense his presence. She finally turned, her movements slow. Her face was pale, her eyes a little red, but they were clear. She looked at him, waiting. Finch didn't speak right away. He just studied her, his head slightly tilted. It was the way he looked at a new business proposal, searching for the core truth beneath the presentation. One of his associates, the older man with kind eyes and silver hair, was the one who broke the silence. He had gotten up too and now stood a pace behind Finch. His voice, when he spoke, was gentle, full of a genuine wonder that filled the still room. That, he said, the word hanging in the air, that was not the playing of a casual hobbyist. That was not someone who used to play a little. He took a small step closer, his hands clasped in front of him. The phrasing, the touch on the keys, that is a technique honed over thousands of hours. That is a conservatory technique. He paused, his eyes searching Alara's face. Forgive me for asking, but who was your teacher? The question was so direct, so specific, that it cut through Alara's numbness. It was a door opening to the past she had tried so hard to lock away. She swallowed, her throat tight. The name felt dangerous on her tongue, a secret she'd kept for years. She looked from the kind-eyed man to Finch, who was listening intently, his arms now crossed. She opened her mouth, and her voice came out as a dry whisper. Professor Chen, Alastair Chen, at the Aldrich Conservatory. The effect on the older man was instant. His eyes widened, and he actually took a small step back, as if pushed by the name. A slow smile of recognition and sadness spread across his face. Alastair Chen, he repeated, his voice full of warmth and memory. He was a dear friend, a brilliant, demanding, wonderful teacher. He looked at Alara with new eyes, seeing past the server's uniform. He spoke of his students like they were his children. He had such hopes. He paused, and the air in the room seemed to grow heavier. The other diners were listening unabashedly now, this real-life drama far more compelling than any dessert. There was one student, the man continued, his voice dropping slightly. A few years back, a girl he called his once-in-a-decade talent. He said she had a touch that could make the piano weep or sing, but he also worried about her, said her nerves were like glass. He was terrified for her final jury. The man's gaze was locked on Alara. She vanished just before it, walked away and never came back. It broke his heart. He retired not long after. Every word was a hammer tap on Alara's heart. She could see Professor Chen's face, his disappointed, confused eyes when she'd told him she was leaving. He hadn't yelled. He'd just looked so tired. She had never allowed herself to think about what her departure had done to him. She'd been too wrapped up in her own shame. A single tear escaped, tracing a clean line down her cheek. She didn't wipe it away. She just nodded, a tiny, painful movement. That was me, she breathed. A collective murmur rippled through the restaurant. The story was becoming a legend in real time. The waitress was a prodigy, a runaway genius. Finch had been silent through all of this, absorbing every word. His shrewd business mind was clicking pieces into place. The raw talent he'd heard was now explained, given a history, a pedigree. He saw not just a talented pianist, but a narrative, a story of buried treasure. But more than that, for the first time that night, he saw a person, not a pawn in his game. He uncrossed his arms. His voice, when he finally spoke, had lost all its theatrical challenge. It was low, steady, and direct. "Why are you here?" he asked. It wasn't an accusation. It was a real question. Clearing plates, wiping tables. With hands like that? With a gift like that? Alara looked at him, then at the kind-eyed man who had known her teacher, then out at the sea of watching faces. For years, the answer had been a simple, brutal mantra in her head, asterisk because I failed, because I'm not strong enough, asterisk, but saying it out loud, here, now, after the music had just spoken for her so powerfully, felt wrong. It felt like a lie. The stage, she began, her voice gaining a little strength. The performance, it felt like a cage. Everyone watching, waiting for a mistake. It was like I could hear their thoughts. And one day, I just froze. The music was all still in here. She tapped her chest, echoing her old teacher's words without realizing it. But it couldn't get out. It was trapped. And after that, the idea of sitting in front of people again, it felt like being asked to walk into a fire. She looked down at her hands, the pianist's hands that carried dirty dishes. I thought if I walked away completely, the feeling would go away, the love of it and the fear of it. But it doesn't work like that. The love stays, it just hurts in a different way. Finch listened, nodding slowly. He had built his fortune on understanding problems and seeing pathways others missed. He heard two things clearly: an immense, undeniable talent, and a distribution problem. The traditional concert hall, the single make or break performance, was a broken channel for this particular artist. He glanced at his associate, the older man, who gave a slight, knowing nod. They were thinking the same thing. Finch turned his full attention back to Alara. The smirk was gone, replaced by a focused intensity. Sit with us, he said, not as a command, but as an invitation. He gestured back to his booth. Finish your shift, then come and have a proper drink. Not as a waitress, not as a party trick, but as the person who just played that piece. He looked over at the manager, Paul, who was hovering by the kitchen door, looking utterly bewildered. She's done for the night, Finch said, in a tone that allowed no argument. Put her on a paid break, indefinitely. He then turned and walked back to his booth, not waiting to see if Alara would follow. He had issued a new challenge, but this one was different. It was a door held open. It was up to her to walk through it. Alara stood by the piano, the silence returning, but it was a different silence now. It was no longer heavy with judgment, but buzzing with possibility. She looked at the piano keys, still warm from her touch. Then she looked at the booth where the wealthy man and his associate waited. For the first time in years, the ghost felt quiet. It had been heard. And the next move, for the first time in just as long, felt like her own. She took a deep breath, smoothed down her server's shirt, and began to walk across the room, not as a retreat, but toward a conversation she never could have imagined. The walk back to the corner booth felt longer than the walk to the piano. Every eye in the restaurant followed her, but the weight of their stares had changed. It wasn't curiosity about a spectacle anymore. It was something closer to respect, or awe, or simple stunned silence. Alara felt their gazes like heat on her skin, but she kept her eyes forward. On the table where the two men waited, the older man, the one who knew her teacher, had pulled a chair over from a nearby table. He gave her a small, encouraging smile as she approached. The woman who had been Finch's other associate was gone, her wine glass half empty on the table. It was just the three of them now. Please, the older man said, gesturing to the empty chair. Sit, my name is Arthur. By the way, Alara sat, her movement stiff. She was suddenly hyper-aware of her uniform, of the faint smell of roasted garlic and coffee that clung to her clothes, of how out of place she was in this plush booth. Finch was watching her. His earlier intense expression softened into something more contemplative. A server, a young man Alara worked with, appeared instantly at the table. He looked at her with wide eyes, a silent question on his face. She gave him the tiniest shrug. Bring us a pot of the French press coffee, Finch said to the young man, his tone casual but leaving no room for discussion. And whatever she would like. He nodded towards Alara. Just coffee is fine, Alara said, her voice still a little unsteady. The young server nodded and vanished, moving with a new urgency. For a moment, no one spoke. The clatter of the kitchen and the resumed murmurs of the other diners created a buffer around their booth. Arthur broke the silence, his voice gentle. Professor Chen spoke of you often, especially near the end. He never blamed you, you know. He blamed the system. He said it was designed to grind down sensitive artists, to reward showmanship over soul. He shook his head slowly. Hearing you play just now, I heard his teaching, that emphasis on color, on emotion over empty virtuosity. But I also heard you. The soul he worried the system would crush is very much intact. Alara felt a new lump form in her throat. The idea that her teacher had talked about her, had worried about her, after she'd disappeared. It was a pain and a comfort all at once. I thought he'd be ashamed of me, she whispered, the words escaping before she could stop them. Never, Arthur said firmly. Confused, yes, concerned, but never ashamed. The coffee arrived. The server poured 3 cups with a nervous flourish and then retreated. The rich, dark aroma filled the space between them. Finch finally stirred a spoonful of raw sugar into his cup. The tiny clink of porcelain on porcelain sounding loud. You have a product, he said abruptly, his business voice returning. But it was layered now with something else. A rare one. But your distribution model is completely broken. In fact, it's non-existent. Elara blinked, thrown by the language. A product. Your music, Finch said, as if it were obvious. The traditional method, the concert hall. The single high-stakes performance. The critics, it failed for you. It's a bad retail location, so you closed up shop. He took a sip of his coffee. That doesn't mean the product is worthless. It means you need a new storefront. Arthur leaned forward. What my friend is trying to say, in his rather clinical way, is that the world of music has changed. When we were young, there was one path. Now, there are 1,000. Finch set his cup down. I heard 2 things when you played. I heard a skill that very few people on Earth possess, and I heard a story that people would connect to. That combination is an opportunity. He looked directly at her, his gaze sharp. I don't do charity, I invest. I see a clear problem, a gifted artist with no viable outlet. I see a potential solution, an outlet built for the artist, not the other way around. Elara's mind was spinning. This wasn't pity or a handout. It was a negotiation. It felt strange, almost disrespectful to talk about her deepest failure and her private love in terms of products and distribution. But another part of her, the part that was tired of being broke and invisible, listened closely. What kind of solution? She asked, her fingers tightening around the warm coffee cup. Finch pulled out his phone, tapped the screen a few times, and slid it across the table. It displayed a sleek, modern website for a recording studio, a state-of-the-art home studio, not in an intimidating professional complex. In a quiet space you control. High-end microphones, a digital piano that can mimic any sound, software that lets you compose, record, and edit everything yourself. He zoomed in on an image. Soundproofing, so you can play at 3 a.m. if you want to. No one watching, no one waiting for a mistake. Elara stared at the image. It looked like a sanctuary. That's the tool. Finch continued, taking his phone back. The platform is the rest of the world. You wouldn't play for a room of 500 critics. You'd record in your safe space, and then your music could go to 5 million people online. You could teach master classes via video call to students across the globe. You could compose for films, for games industries that need emotion, not stage presence. You could release your own albums, directly to the people who want to hear them. Arthur chimed in, his eyes bright. You could tell your story, not as a tragedy, but as a rediscovery. That piece you played tonight, people would feel that. They'd want to know the person behind it. The modern audience craves authenticity more than perfection. The ideas came at her like a rushing river. It was overwhelming. It sounded like a fantasy. All of that costs money. A lot of it, she said. The practical waitress and her surfacing, the equipment, the software, the space. Finch nodded. It's an investment. My investment. In you, and in the business model. We would structure it properly. A small company. I provide the seed funding for the studio setup, the initial marketing, the website. You provide the talent, the content, the work. We share the revenue from music sales, teaching fees, and commissions according to an agreed-upon split, until the initial investment is repaid. After that, the partnership continues, or you buy me out. It's a business, not a gift. He said it all so matter-of-factly. It was the most incredible, terrifying proposition she had ever heard. It wasn't a ticket back to the concert hall she feared. It was a blueprint for building a whole new kind of musical life, one with walls she could design herself. The pressure, Elara said quietly, almost to herself. If it's your money, if it's my money, then my job is to create an environment where the product your music can thrive. Finch interrupted. My job is to handle the business noise so you don't have to. Your job is to do what you just did, to feel it and to play it. The only audience you need to please is the microphone, and eventually, the people who find their way to your music. He leaned back, giving her space. I'm not asking for an answer tonight. I'm asking you to think about it, to imagine a room where the only person you have to be brave for is yourself. Arthur smiled. Chen would have loved this idea. He was always complaining about the old ways. Elara looked from one man to the other. The ghost of her past was in this booth, represented by Arthur's kind memories, and the unsettling, thrilling possibility of a future was represented by Finch's sharp, clear offer. She thought of the silence after her playing tonight. It hadn't been the silence of failure. It had been the silence of people being moved. She had reached them, not from a stage, but from a place of raw honesty. Maybe that was enough. Maybe that was even better. The waitress part of her wanted to say no, to retreat to the familiar territory of small tips and predictable struggles. But the pianist, the one who had just spoken after years of silence, was leaning forward. "Can I?" she started, her voice stronger now. "Can I see a draft of what that agreement might look like?" A slow, genuine smile spread across Alistair Finch's face. It wasn't the smirk of a man who had won a bet. It was the smile of someone who had just found a potentially brilliant investment, of course. He said. He pulled a simple, elegant pen from his inside pocket and took a clean paper napkin from the holder. "Let's start with the broad strokes right now." And as he began to sketch a simple timeline and list of core ideas on the linen napkin, Elara felt the world, for the first time in a very long time, begin to quietly, fundamentally, change its shape around her. The next few weeks were a blur, but a blur of a color Elara had forgotten existed. It wasn't the gray haze of her old routine, or the stark, fearful white of the concert stage. It was a golden, overwhelming, terrifying shade of possibility. She gave her notice at the gilded chime. Her manager, Paul, just shook his head with a bewildered smile and told her he'd never seen anything like it. On her last shift, several of the regular diners stopped her to quietly say how much they'd enjoyed her music. It was a different kind of tip, one that felt like a warm stone in her pocket. The agreement with Finch wasn't just a napkin sketch for long. His lawyers and her new lawyer, a patient woman Finch recommended, who explained every clause in simple terms, turned it into a proper, but fair, contract. Finch's investment firm created a new, small company. He was the silent partner, providing the capital. She was the founding artist and creative director, providing the sweat and the soul. The first purchase was the space. It wasn't a fancy downtown loft. It was a quiet, sunlit room over a bookstore in a neighborhood she could actually afford. The walls were thick, the light was good, and the faint smell of old paper from downstairs was a comfort. Then came the deliveries. Boxes of mysterious foam panels for soundproofing, giant flat packages that became desks and shelves, and then, finally, the equipment. The day the piano arrived was the day it all became real. It wasn't the grand piano from the restaurant. It was a high-end digital stage piano, sleek and black. To anyone else, it might have looked like a keyboard, but to Elara, it was a spaceship control panel. It could sound like a concert grand, a tinkly old upright, a harpsichord, or strings. It connected directly to the computer that hummed on her new desk, the studio monitors, the microphones. The interface. It was all a labyrinth of wires and buttons that made her head spin. For the first week, she just sat in the empty room on the floor, overwhelmed. The ghost of her fear had followed her here, whispering that this was just another test she would fail, that she'd waste Finch's money and prove herself a fraud after all. But then she remembered his words. Asterisk, the only audience you need to please is the microphone. Asterisk, she started small. She didn't try to record a perfect take of a Chopin ballade. She just turned everything on, sat at the piano, and played a simple scale. She listened to it play back through the speakers. It sounded clear and pure. She played a chord, then another. She made a mistake, hit a wrong note. She flinched, waiting for judgment that didn't come. She just stopped the recording and played it again. It was a revelation. She could start over. She could piece a performance together note by note if she wanted to. There was no one and done. The pressure valve, slowly, began to release. She started posting small things online, as Arthur had suggested. Not polished performances, but moments. A video of her working out a difficult passage, talking to the camera about why it was tricky. A short clip of the sunset from her studio window, with a snippet of a melody she was composing over it. She told her story, bit by bit, in captions. Not as a sob story, but as a fact. I used to play. Then I didn't for a long time. And now I'm learning how to do it again, differently. People found her. First a trickle, then a stream. They weren't classical music critics. They were students, older folks who missed playing. People who just loved the sound of a piano. They commented things like, "That sounded like how my heart feels." Or "I gave up painting for the same reason." This gives me hope. 6 months after the night at the Gilded Chime, she was ready. She had worked on a collection of pieces. Some were the classical works she loved, but played with the freedom of someone alone in a room. Others were her own compositions, melodies that had lived in her head for years, finally finding their way out. She recorded each track in her safe, sunlit room, sometimes over dozens of takes, editing until it felt right to her, and only heard. She titled the album First Note *. The night it released online, she sat in her studio in the dark, too nervous to look at her phone or computer. She just stared out the window at the city lights. This felt more exposing than the restaurant. This was sending her heart out into the world to be judged by thousands of strangers. With no immediate reaction to read, she must have fallen asleep in her chair. The morning sun woke her, aching and stiff. Her phone, which she had silenced, was blinking with a chaotic torrent of notifications. Her hands shook as she picked it up. It wasn't just a few messages. It was hundreds. Emails, social media tags, direct messages. A major music streaming service had featured her album on its classical discovery playlist. A film composer from another country had written, asking if she'd be interested in contributing to a soundtrack. Her favorite online music teacher, a man with millions of subscribers, had posted a review titled, "The most human piano album I've heard this year." People weren't just listening, they were connecting. They wrote to tell her which track made them cry on their commute, which one they played for their newborn to fall asleep, which one reminded them of a lost loved one. The story, the waitress, the challenge, the return was part of it, but the music was standing on its own. A few weeks later, a proper royalty statement arrived. She opened the PDF with her eyes half squinted, afraid to look. The number at the bottom was not a fortune, but it was more money than she had ever seen from a single month of work in her life. It was proof. It was viability. She met Finch for coffee, in a normal cafe this time. He slid an envelope across the table. It was the first repayment check, for a portion of his initial investment. "Ahead of schedule," he said, with a satisfied nod. He looked at her, and for the first time, she saw something like pride in his eyes. Not just the gleam of a good deal. The product is good. The distribution is working. But the real moment, the one that truly ended the old story and began the new one, happened a month after that. She was asked to give a live talk and perform a single piece at a small, intimate arts conference. The old fear rose up, metallic and cold in her throat. A room, people, watching. She almost said no. But then she thought about her studio. She thought about the microphone that had become her friend. She agreed, but on one condition, that she could set up her digital piano on stage, facing away from the audience, towards a large screen. On that screen, she said, would be a live feed from a camera pointed at her hands on the keys. The organizers, intrigued, agreed. The day arrived. Walking onto that stage was the hardest thing she'd ever done. The lights were bright, the room was full of shadows. Her heart hammered, but she didn't look at the faces. She walked to her piano, set perpendicular to the audience. She adjusted the camera, pointing it at the keyboard. On the giant screen behind her, her own hands appeared, large and clear. She sat down. The audience was silent. She could feel them, but she didn't have to see them. She looked at her hands on the screen, and she was back in her safe room. She played a piece from her album, one of her own compositions. It wasn't perfect. Her fingers trembled visibly on the big screen at the start, but as she played, they steadied. The connection wasn't between her and the crowd. It was between her hands and the music, and the screen let everyone in on that private conversation. When she finished, the applause was warm, real. She stood, turned, and finally looked at them. She gave a small, genuine smile, and a wave from her pianist's hands. She hadn't conquered the stage. She had reinvented it. She had built a bridge between her private sanctuary and the public world, on her own terms. Back in her studio the next day, the sun streamed in. There was an email from a young woman who had been at the talk. She wrote, "I'm a writer. I have such a fear of sharing my work. Watching you play for your hands, and not for us, showed me a way forward. Thank you." Lara leaned back in her chair, the morning quiet around her. The wealthy man's challenge had been a spark, thrown into the dark room of her abandoned life. But the fire it lit was her own. The music hadn't changed the room that night at the Gilded Chime. It had given her the tools to build a new room altogether. And now, from this room she had built, note by note, her music was finally going out into the world. Not as a plea, but as a gift.